Welcome to Retconlang, the new show that takes bad conlangs and retcons them. Now, that warrants some discussion. What makes a conlang bad? Objectively speaking, a conlang is bad if it fails to meet its goals. Many of the languages we're going to be talking about on the show do in fact reach their goals. It's just that these goals were purely aesthetic, and the people who made them lacked linguistic know-how, and ended up relexing English or spouting off some total nonsense. Creating a naming language or an English cipher is entirely valid, and for many can achieve the same level of immersion as a more complete conlang. But that's not what we're here to do. We're here to, in essence, realize these languages as they might be within the context of the fictional worlds we love so much. To quote David J. Peterson, we have the ability to maximize the authenticity of a world that doesn't exist, or even couldn't exist, and fans should demand nothing less. We can do immersive now, and do it well. We'll be starting this show by looking at my first and worst conlang. Today we'll be retconning Norstalch. Woo boy, let's do this! Let's start with some world context. Norstalch exists in a very early version of my world, which I cringe every time I think about. Thanks, 14-year-old me, you're the worst. The basic premise of Norstalch was that it was the language of a tribe living in a post-apocalyptic southern Michigan. These Anglophonic speakers had become associated with the group of Scandinavian soldiers, causing their languages to mix. Now I, as an adult, do now realize how little sense this makes, but bear with me here. I plainly did not understand how conlanging worked. My first exposure to the concept were the Creole languages featured in the Fallout New Vegas DLC, Honest Hearts.
A virgin forjatly guy.
And so my understanding of conlanging boiled down to, you take English and then add words from other languages so it's harder to understand. This was compounded by certain extremely poorly worded Wikipedia articles, which led me to believe that Tolkien's Elvish languages were quite literally derived from Finnish and Welsh. That last bit is important as well. I was quite unaware that Finnish is not, in fact, a North Germanic language, and that it is in fact more closely related to Hungarian than any Germanic language, and so I drew from Finnish as well. And then I also drew from Polish because reasons. I don't quite understand what I was thinking at the time. And when I say drew from, I don't mean I read extensive grammars and lexicons and borrowed concepts. I mean that I quite literally, whenever I couldn't think of a way to make an English word sound more German in a pleasing fashion, would open Google Translate and translate the word I wanted to replace in various languages, from my list of Norwegian, German, Dutch, Swedish, Finnish, and Polish. Funnily enough, I didn't use Danish for some reason, until I found something I liked. The result was really bad. Like, really bad. In the end, I eventually got a clue and was extremely upset with my past self for being so foolish. I ended up deleting most of the material I had for Norstalch. Years later, however, I found a single page that contained the last remaining written Norstalch. It was a series of conversations between various characters I don't actually remember. Interestingly enough, some of these were between Anglophones and Norstalch speakers, implying there was a degree of mutual intelligibility between the two groups. Here's an example. What can I get ya? Ewola harmit. Okay, give me a minute. It's in the back. Ich harve ze Nors. Eka mid wola minja ist entfernt. Here you go. Meat imported from Kalamazoo. Worklik. Eka des tag wola nan varilin. Oh, and that text was originally untranslated. That's just my best guess. And I tried to approximate how I remember pronouncing it, which was also pretty bad. Thanks again, 14-year-old me, you're the worst. Now, let's retcon. Let's start with the basic premise, since the original makes not a lick of sense. Perhaps in this alternate Norstalch, rather than a post-apocalyptic Creole, we have a highly diverged dialect of English, one heavily influenced by a group of second language learners. In the Midwestern United States, we have a large population of ethnically German people. My own county is 43% German, for example, who have abandoned their language and culture for reasons largely stemming from the world wars and American exceptionalism. Let's imagine an alternate Midwest where those immigrants held on to their language for much longer, allowing it to more heavily color the English of the region. Another fun fact, a good number of Midwestern cities are very Polish, or at least Slavic. Cleveland, in fact, has one of the largest Polish minorities in the entire nation. So, as a reference to the inexplicable presence of Polish in the original Norstalch, we'll say that these Polish and other Slavic immigrants also had influence over our new Norstalch. All in all, we're going for something almost like English, a more Germanic variety of English, peppered with German calques and loanwords. We'll call this new language Norstalch. Moving swiftly onward, we have phonology. Now, Norstalch didn't really have a phonology at all. Not only did I not understand the IPA at all, I never bothered to transcribe what sounds there were in any form. So the general idea was, it's English, but with a bad Skyrim accent. In Norstalch, I decided I wanted to blend the traits of German with aspects of the real-world Midwestern English, with some traits inspired specifically by my own very strange flavor of English. Looking at our consonants, some big standouts you'll notice are the lack of an L sound, as well as the presence of the uvular stop ka, which is very strange. These two traits are actually connected. In this particular dialect of English, there was extensive vocalization of the lateral, even in non-coda environments. When it didn't become a vowel, it became a velar sound of some kind, most typically a velar approximate ra, which eventually merged with the quote, guttural voiced fricative ra. And velar stops bumping up against the sound later became uvular stops. Meanwhile, the traditional ha or ha debuccalized to ha, leading to the ha distinction in the quote, guttural place of articulation. In terms of vowels, we essentially have a vowel system similar to the northern city's vowel shift inventory, but a bit Germanicized, and with mild nasalization of certain vowels in some more local dialects, typically those in more Polish regions. Nothing to write home about, really. Moving on to grammar, and specifically nouns. The original Norstalch was, as stated earlier, just English, with a lack of irregularity, because literally every beginning conlanger thinks irregularity is bad for whatever reason. Norstalch nouns are very simple, reflecting how in English we don't have much in the way of case marking outside the pronouns. However, Norstalch did develop an overt dative case marker in the form of the principle on, which criticizes onto indefinite nouns. The pronouns are fairly similar to English, with the exception of the new dative series drawn from the compounding of pronouns with the on particle. Norstalch verbs have a bit more going on under the hood, accomplishing most tense aspect and mood information through the use of a whole series of auxiliaries, as well as a very simple affix which forms the simple past un, and the future tense tends to be formed with the suffix o, which gets attached to the subject, but this isn't always the case. Most of the very fine-tuned modal information is grammatically expressed in the past tense, with the future being considered more irrealis overall. There are also many irregular verbs, mainly derived from strong verbs or on analogy with strong verbs, such as the irregular si versus so, or svel versus svo. Norstalch spelling was very strange, a sort of wrestling match between attempting to remind myself of where the innumerable loans came from and the trying to remember how I was pronouncing everything. Funnily enough, after thinking about it for a while, I decided that this is the one element of Norstalch I'll be keeping. Much like real-world Scots, there's no standard dialect of Norstalch and no one standard spelling. Some people spell to preserve etymology, some people spell to reflect pronunciation. There's a nice healthy mix. This of course only hurts the reputation of the poor Norstalch speakers in the eyes of their fellow Americans. The vocabulary of Norstalch is mostly derived directly from English. However, even outside of direct loanwords, there's a lot of influence from German. Terms like pseudo-creole instead of actor, or Rennshed instead of umbrella. Many words gained secondary uses based on their cognates in German, such as ken, which has the traditional use of to be able to, but also means to know how to, exemplified by sentences like, "Can you the English sprache or die Norstalch you can?" Now that's about all I have time to cover here today, but be sure to follow me on Twitter at DoesJuno, leave a comment below, and stay tuned for the next episode of Retconlang, where we'll be tackling the language of dragons, Dovazul.